Welcome, everyone, back to another podcast of the Center for Asian American Christianity. My name is David Chao, and it's my delight to bring Amar Peterman to our podcast. Amar is a old friend and colleague from Princeton and also from the work of the Center for Asian American Christianity. Welcome to the podcast, Amar.
Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
So, something big has happened. You've published your first authored book, Becoming Neighbors, The Common Good Made Local, with Eerdmans. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Publishing a book is a labor of love. It takes great perseverance. Um, there's usually a story behind the story you tell in the book. And so I thought we could just begin there. Could you tell us a little bit about your personal and spiritual journey and how you came to care so deeply about neighboring?
Yeah, this book was the very early seeds of it were planted before I even thought about writing a book. And let's say it's born out of my own experience of yes, belonging, but also deep unbelonging. So I was born in northern India. I'm an adoptee, and as an infant was brought to northeast Wisconsin and raised in the cornfields of a Polish Catholic neighborhood called Pulaski. And that's the where my friends were. That's where I went to school, and I tried to find my way um, through that space, playing in polka bands and marching bands, and tr you know, participating in Fat Tuesday and getting a potchki at the local bakery with all of my friends, and trying to feel like I belonged in that space. And there certainly were moments of that, but there was still a very stark difference that I am not Polish. This is not my heritage. This is not the people that I claim as my own. Uh, Mixed with that was being spiritually formed at a church in the next neighborhood over, at a white evangelical megachurch. And there too, I found pockets of belonging. I mean, I grew up in the Christian tradition. This was where Christianity came to life for me, where I learned about theology and had a practicing worship community. Uh, it was also a white evangelical church that did not love my questions around race and ethnicity. Um, I grew up in a time where I think we're on the precipice of what is now a full blown kind of racial reckoning as a nation. And so I had questions about why we were so suspicious of the people on the other side of town who were predominantly Black and Hispanic. Why it was there's a lot of stigma around going across the bridge to the east side of Green Bay, where a lot of different restaurants and churches and people were, and to make sure to stay on the west side and questions like this. And so I would still when I got my driver's license, I ventured over there and went, oh, there's just other people here, different, I would say better food. There were community centers and parks and softball leagues and whatever else that I was told to stay away from, that were so stigmatized. But once I went over there, I began to even identify with those folks more than this white evangelical megachurch, who shared my faith tradition but did not share my experiences. As an Indian American, broadly as a non-white person in a predominantly white space. Uh, and so the short story is despite that sense of belonging, ended up in Bible college in downtown Chicago at a very white evangelical fundamentalist institution. But despite being in this institution, I was in downtown Chicago. And so even more than in Green Bay, uh, I was exposed to people from all across the world, many of whom who were Christians and many of whom who weren't. And again, was given access to this broader world of um, theology and Christianity and beyond. But in those spaces, I had to reconcile with what it meant to find belonging in these spaces, that were the spaces I was told to be weary of, to be afraid of, to be cautious to enter into. And so the book arose in many ways out of this experience of unbelonging, where I was told I was supposed to belong, and deep belonging, where I was told to be cautious or suspicious. And it led to this realization that was then enforced by the theology I learned somewhat in secret in Bible college and then very openly in seminary, uh, that God shows up in the most unexpected of places, and that God's goodness expands far beyond the walls of the church. And if we can begin to see that, we can begin to reconcile this notion of belonging with spaces that are not explicitly Christian. It may even very much be uh, spaces where people of other faith traditions come in the fullness of their tradition, as we seek, as the book talks about, a common good. And so, a lot of there's a lot there, and even more in terms of how my own story interacts with the creation of this book. But it comes from these experiences of both belonging and unbelonging.
The book was a lifetime in the making. Your
Yeah,
life, your lifetime.
yeah,
That's interesting. You mentioned this phrase, racial reckoning. Let me kind of play around with it a little. Um, did you ever have like a racial reckoning with yourself? In other words, here's another kind of way to play it. It's like, when did you realize you were an Asian American? Or that's just one provocation. And I'm curious because you mentioned something about the kind of this theological development sort of incipiently undercover in college and then full blown in seminary. So there's a kind of theological awakening and then there's kind of this racial awakening. I'm interested in this, but maybe this has something to do with that.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, these are great questions that I don't get to talk about often. And so I'm glad that this is the space that I can share them. I think this audience will especially hopefully resonate with it. Um, there's this work of formation that is so interesting. That's, I think, deeply uh, dependent on the people around us and the places that we inhabit. And so I knew I was an Indian American from the jump. No one looked like me. No one had a name. There was no other Amars in the places that I grew up. Uh, and so that was made clear. And, there's some adoptees have the story of not knowing that they were adopted. There's no hiding it. I was adopted, and I was brought to this new place. And at the same time, I was again spiritually formed in a white evangelical megachurch and in a broadly conservative Polish Catholic neighborhood. And so despite these questions of um, race and ethnicity and culture and belonging, I still was broadly socially and politically conservative in a way that we still see today. I mean, I had an article in Sojourners a couple of years back, college. There was a black preacher from the south side of Chicago who came up to a chapel that we were required to go to and began talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and protests that were currently happening in the city. And I, in all my self-righteousness, got up and walked out. I said, this is not the gospel. This is this pollution of all of the social things and this justice language that's getting in the way of preaching the gospel. Um, and I went up and I was deep in the Facebook algorithms of Tommy Lahren and Matt Walsh and The Blaze and Fox News. And I thought this was genuine, authentic Christianity, um, because this is what I was raised in. And there was, at that point, no alternative for me. This was just how things were. Um, I contrast in the article that with my last semester of Bible college. Somehow they got Willie Jennings to come speak at the school's like theology week for chapel. And instead of walking out, I was in the front row with my notebook, vigorously taking notes in awe of this person who, over those 4 years, had the chance to read and have my own reckoning with certainly the Christian imagination, but also some articles he had written about place and land and people and ancestors. And so my own reckoning came through meeting people in Bible college. I dedicate the book to someone we both know, Ashish Varma, who is uh, a professor of mine, a mentor, a friend, an advisor, a confidant. When I began to realize that this algorithmic Fox News hyper-conservative path wasn't didn't clearly did not include me and did not want to include me, and if anything wanted to erase, dehumanize, minimize me and my experiences. I turned to him and I knocked on his door. There was always his office was always suspiciously dark, as if he wasn't there, but he was studying under the light of a lamp so that no one would presumably knock on his door. And I still did. And I said, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do here. I don't know if there is a place within Christianity for me. The professors and pastors I had met said something that I think folks hear too often, sadly, which is that uh, I would have to leave my Indianness behind to become a Christian. That you put aside your biases and your presuppositions and you find your identity in Christ. Of course, that's a directive only for people who are not white in the hermeneutics classroom. Um, and so seemingly I had more reading to do than my peers. Uh, and I told Ashish, I don't think I can do that. And he said, no, you can't. But the thing is that I think your Indianness makes you a better Christian, and your Christian faith makes you a better Indian. Um, and no one had told me that before. And he not only told me that, but he lived it out for the years that we were together, that I was studying with him, that he was sharing books on his shelf that would never have been assigned or been allowed to be listed on a syllabus for a publicly listed class. Uh, and he really helped me through this my own reckoning. And in doing so, brought me into conversation with so many people uh, by way of books, but also lectures, articles, etc., that opened my world to a Christianity that multiple Christianities that I had never known existed before. And so yeah, and then he was also the one who encouraged me to apply to Princeton Seminary and said, "You should do it. What's the worst that happens? They say no, and then you go and you do something else." But he's like, "You can do it, and you should do it." And so without him, I would have certainly been lost in Chicago in some way or another, and very well would not have made my way out to the East Coast to have what he taught me deepened all the more. So Ashish is part of how I ended up at Princeton Seminary, which was a deeply wonderful, informative space. I mean, this book comes out of Princeton. In the book, in the acknowledgments, I talk about how this book was truly formed between uh, Princeton Seminary and CRW, the apartment complex that many of us lived, and the Gingered Peach down the road that had the best pastries and coffee. And I remember sitting out there and the beginning ideas of this book and thinking about the common good and what tables and neighbors look like took place there. And so there's much I could say about Princeton Seminary, but I think at the core of it, what you'll find is that many of the people I cite in the book, for being a relatively short book, the bibliography is extensive, and that's intentional. Is very intentional to have so many citations to be pointing people to the people who have benefited my own thinking and writing and understanding. Because of the brevity of the book, I think there's so much more to say, and there's folks who have been saying it for a long time, and those are folks that I met uh, at Princeton Seminary. They're the books that you assign that I read and continue to read the footnotes from those books to find more books on top of that, and sat in the library and tried to read as much as I could. But Princeton Seminary provided uh, not only the theological education, but the ability to practice by virtue of being a seminary. what this looks like on the ground. And so I also talk about Jacob's Well, a deeply multi-ethnic church trying to live faithfully as Christians in a uh, deeply deeply complicated time, and what it means to gather across our lines of deep difference in this moment. And so this book is deeply and wonderfully indebted to my time there as well. But that's a lot to say about the formation of this book and my own experience there. But hopefully it resonates with folks who are listening.
What led you to write Becoming Neighbors, and why did this book feel necessary for you to tackle?
I think for me, it was necessary because would look out my window and I questioned, how in the world do I love the people across the street from me? Um, and that I mean in a literal sense of the neighbors around me, but I also mean it figuratively as we look out in the world and we see such hostility and seemingly a culture and a society that gives us every permission to hate, to uh, say the most vile things about one another, to fight and to bicker. And the question that I wanted to try to answer was, what does a practice of neighbor love look like in this moment? And I went searching for answers, and folks had various thoughts and opinions on how to do this, but a lot of them reiterated my question of, I don't know, how do we do this? And so that's where the thrust of the book came out of, was finding that there were seemingly few answers as to how we ought to love our neighbors. And in the process of writing, I think there's a healthy side to that, in that we each have particular neighbors who need to be loved in particular ways, who have specific needs and concerns that are deeply contextual to the community that you share. And so my task is not to prescribe, these are the specific ways that you love your neighbor. This is how you should talk to them. This is what you should say. This is the magic formula to create a common good. But instead to say, the church has long wrestled with these questions in every context and place and time, some more divided than others. But I think the church and the history of Christian thought uh, has a lot to say about how we might do this well, not in prescribing specific talking points, but saying, if Christianity is a way of life, then this is a disposition of love that we live out of towards the people around us. And so that's what the book is really trying to emphasize, is cultivating this disposition of love. And I talk about how do we cultivate a desire to love our neighbors? Because if we're not doing that, then the the material practices mean little to nothing if we don't actually first desire to love and enjoy our neighbors in and for themselves, precisely just because they are our neighbors.
That's really rich. Very, very, so much for me to chew on as I continue to chew on it. This theme in your book about absence or domination comes up. And I want to, so you suggest that Christians often approach public life through either absence or domination. Why was naming that pattern so important for you?
That's a great question. It was important in that I think both are two extremes that don't actually pursue any meaningful common good. Um, I think Christians are often absent from the table because historically, and specifically white Christians, have the means and resources to accomplish whatever they want to in their society. They have the biggest gathering spaces. They're often very well funded. They have people in power who are in their congregations. And so they say, oh, we want to do this for our community. There's no consideration of, well, how do we gather the resources? Do we have to partner with the synagogue or the mosque next door so that we can do this work together? It's, oh no, just dream up these things and then we do them, which to a degree, like, is fine to do. And Christians have done wonderful things in their community because they have the resources to do so. At the same time, absence from the shared table where people gather together across their differences means that the blind spots of these Christians are never challenged. And so they go about their work, but then again it goes back to they presume how to love their neighbors without actually asking their neighbors how they ought to be, how they desire to be loved. And then they build these grand organizations and programs through their churches that seem to address a need, but then can at times end up doing more harm than good. Um, the flip side of that shares a similar, you could say superiority, you could just say closed-mindedness, is that Christians will show up to the shared table, but they will walk past their seat, grab the microphone, and assume that they are the ones running the meeting, that everyone has been sitting and twiddling their thumbs, waiting for them to show up and tell them what to do. Uh, this is also this is the posture of domination that says Christians have the right answer. We have the claim on what love is, what goodness is, what the best thing for our community is. And we don't need to listen to anyone else. They need to take direction from us. Those are two extremes that I think are incredibly detrimental to the health of a society. At a local level, clearly, I think we see today at a national level, uh, the invitation of the book is to say, take a seat, learn from your neighbors, be in conversation and in relationship with them. Um, Often I get this question of I work at an interfaith organization and have organized conferences and gatherings and fellowships where people who are deeply committed to different traditions show up and talk around shared tables. And more often than not, there will be at least one Christian in these larger gatherings who will ask me, knowing that I'm a Christian, um, when do you evangelize? Like when do you share the gospel with them? Like is there a specific time that we're supposed to do this, or do I just kind of add it into the lunch table conversation? And one, professionally in my position, it's not my job to to share vocally, have an altar call of sorts. Um, but I also say that I don't think that that's our task here. I think if Christians are invited to this shared table to come in the fullness of their tradition and bring the best of it, in all of its liturgies and wisdom and teaching and scriptures and histories, then everyone else gets an equal invite to do the same. Uh, that's the beauty of the table. And that's what's so often missed in this either obviously absence, but also domination, where we don't think we need to learn from anyone else. And the more time I spend with people of other faith traditions, the more my own blind spots are challenged. But I hopefully their blind spots are also challenged. And in doing so, we again cultivate a truly common good that considers everyone in our community and not just the dominant group, not just the majority group, but truly is seeking to consider everyone in this grand vision of goodness for a neighborhood.
You brought up the table. Say more about why you chose the table as the governing image of the book.
Yeah, the short answer is that if the common good is cultivated at a table, and tables are literally everywhere. They are at our coffee shops, they're in our libraries, they're in our classrooms, they're at the restaurant, they're installed on the back of our plane seat. Then that means that the possibility of cultivating a common good is also everywhere. A more theological, I suppose, reason is that when I read the Gospels, and this is something Robert Caro says in a book called Eating Your Way Through the Gospel of Luke, I believe, uh, he says that Jesus is always coming from, at, or going to a meal. And I take that to say Jesus is always coming from, at, or going to a table. That the table is where Jesus does the vast majority of his ministry, spending time with people, enjoying life together with others, laughing, reclining. This is obviously the table is also where Jesus says, "This is my body broken for you. This is my blood poured out for the salvation of the world." Uh, we're in, Lent turning to Holy Week soon. Tables are also what Jesus flips over in righteous indignation. They are a central part of the gospel. And so I think there's just this beautiful image of what it would mean to gather. We also talk, culturally about having a seat at the table as a form of inclusion. And there's a healthy way to look at that. There's also a way to problematize that to say it's not just about having a seat at the table. It is about having a voice represented truly to speak in the fullness of that person's experience, not to tokenize or to, cross off some sort of checkbox of inclusion. Um, and so the table too can offer this deep uh, vision of being together. And I think this is what Jesus' ministry exemplifies for us. And so that's why the table was just such a central image that I wanted to uplift.
You're making me hungry. I love your biblical theology of table. That's really fantastic. Um, Continuing on the culinary theme, let's talk about potluck. So,
Yeah.
why potluck and not melting pot?
Yeah. So when I was in elementary school, early middle school, I first heard this the Schoolhouse Rock song, The Great American Melting Pot. And I remember watching it, and I don't think coincidentally, I think intentionally, all of the people who jump in the melting pot are European immigrants. And so I did not see myself in that video. But then I also thought, what is this? Like, this can't taste good. If all of these people are jumping into this giant vat representing their cultures and beliefs, literal dishes that they bring to a community, to our society, uh, it's no good to have all of this blended up into this thing that we're calling America. Um, so the melting pot is exactly that. It is a melting of all these people and places um, into something homogenous that has no particularity, but we just call it American. And even now, that is problematic in many ways of what it means to be an American, what's presumed uh, by the idea of an American identity. The potluck is the exact opposite. The potluck says, bring your dish and set it on the table next to everyone else's. And you, in deep multi-ethnic community, are going to have the wildest array of dishes put side by side. But in doing so, I mean, I used to be a barista in a different lifetime, and we would do palate trainings. And you'd say, take this, drink this really dark roast coffee and be so bitter. And then we'd eat a piece of, 98% cacao chocolate. And we eat that, and that would be even more bitter. And then you'd say, taste the coffee again. Go, oh, it's so sweet and nutty, and I'm getting all these other things coming out of it. Um, when we join at the potluck, the dishes we are familiar with taste anew when they're eaten alongside dishes that we are unfamiliar with, or those that we wouldn't typically pair together. And I think to the image of the potluck and bringing a dish that's not thrown together with everyone else means that you get to show off uh, your own history, your own story, in a way that it is tasted on its own and also brought into conversation with everyone else's story. Um, and I think that's something that we see deeply. I mean, I think of South Asians who have their own family's chai recipe, and they're all, we share the same basic ingredients when we're making chai, but everyone has their own particular thing. And some are, like myself, like as an adoptee, like I'm creating my own recipe that I will hand down to my children and hopefully the children after them. Others who have Indian heritage that goes back generations and generations say, this is how my ancestors made chai. Uh, and now I am bringing that recipe to the potluck. And in that is this deep particular history that benefits the community. And so I love the illustration of the potluck because it provides this example of what it might mean to be together in a way that um, our particularities are seen as gifts to the greater community. I mean, uh, there's a lot of talk right now about the dangers of diversity, the evils of diversity or pluralism. And I think that couldn't be more wrong. I think that diversity and pluralism are gifts to our society. I think they're a gift to the church. That when Christ prays that we might all be one, he is not thinking of we're all going to turn into this homogenous thing. Uh, he's saying, in all of the complexities and the messiness of people living together under the lordship of Christ is our unity. And this is what we see I talk about in the book. This is the example of the early church who are united at Pentecost. Eric Bretto, your colleague, is the one who introduced me to this kind of imaginative vision of the Spirit comes down in a multiplicity of languages, and the people gathered have to turn to one another and say, or and ask, what did God say to you? Um, and you have to translate in this way and try to understand God showing up in these very particular ways and languages, not in a unifying tongue. But of course, this incredible Pentecost moment fades, and then you're stuck with these people who would otherwise never be in community together, saying we're forming a worshiping community that follows after Christ. And this is the New Testament, is the stories and the teachings of how this church tries to live together. And so this is, for me, this is the potluck. Is this great question of how we gather together across our differences in a way that doesn't meld us into a homogenous thing, but instead sees the particularity that each person brings, and even our differences and conflicts, as gifts to the community, not as hindrances to a true sense of belonging.
What does it mean to be one and universal? And part of what I'm inferring from what you're saying is, well, it can't be at the at the erasure of our social particularity, which could be our gender, our race, our ethnicity. That's fascinating to me. And yet the book is about the common good, right? So there's something about which is a form of shared life together, which in a sense gets at the heart of the Catholicity of the church, the kind of oneness and universality of the church across space and time. And I think that's a really powerful social vision that, dare I say, may be unique to Christianity.
Mm.
That to borrow from La Mansana, the gospel is infinitely translatable. The message of our Lord and Savior is infinitely translatable across space and time, and yet it is one body across space and time. So that's just, I'm chewing on that because I'm also writing on this.
Mm.
I'm writing a short work on Catholicity after Christendom.
Mm.
So let me go to chapter 3 of Becoming Neighbors, where you identify 6 practices. So I hope I get these right: compassion, humility, translation, resonance, lamentation, accompaniment. These are the practices of neighbor love. How did you identify these 6? Why these 6?
Yeah, that's a great question. I I mean, this is something I think that seminary deeply ingrained in me, which is tying these rich theological ideas to lived practices and lived people. And so I wanted to not have it would be an entire book in itself to try and list all of the various practices of neighbor love. Um, Instead, I wanted to hone in on these practices that I think um, move between like some things you would expect, like, oh, compassion. Very much, that could be listed early on in a list of practices of neighbor love. Accompaniment, translation, even lamentation, maybe not so common, commonly assumed practices of neighbor love. But I think these 6 practices get at the heart of living in diverse community, and doing so uniquely as Christians. And so I wanted to position these 6 practices as ones that had tangible examples alongside of them, or provided new language, or a new metaphor or vision for something that has commonly been practiced in the church. And so that's why, we've all heard likely one too many sermons about the parable of the Samaritan. And so I didn't want to spend a whole chapter, even though we certainly could, talking about the parable of the Good Samaritan. But instead, I wanted to draw out some unique things that I had not heard said elsewhere, that were important for me to share. But then I don't know how many people are talking about Hartmut Rosa and Norman Wiersbe when we're engaging practices of neighbor love, a sociologist and an eco-theologian. And so I want to include those. Translation gets at the theological underpinnings are very much like the Yale school of the gospel or the Christianity as a language or as a grammar. And so, what does it mean to take on that language? I cite a little bit of Jamie Smith, who talks about that in the book. But translation, too, I think of, uh, again, in this, I didn't know when I submitted the manuscript how. Uh, I had in mind the suspicion that comes with the need for translation, that people who don't speak English in this country are seen in a certain light, which makes translation a really interesting practice. Uh, I did not know when I submitted the manuscript the extent to which that might be relevant, um, but it is all the more. And so I wanted to uplift translation, especially as um, a way of celebrating this work of uh, the duality of living in two places, being familiar with two languages, two cultures so well that you can communicate between the two. And so that was some reasoning behind that. And then accompaniment came about because in the mid to late stages of writing the book, a friend of mine said, "Have you ever heard of Paul Farmer?" I said, "I don't think so. Like the name's familiar, but I don't think so." Uh, and she said, "Oh, you need to read um, Jenny Block's book on Paul Farmer." And I did in a day and was just captivated by his story and the work that he did. And I think of, Paul Farmer's was a incredible health practitioner. He was also a very socially privileged, somewhat affluent white man who went to Harvard Medical School, and became very much a celebrity in the philanthropy slash public health space. Um, he sets an example of, I think, what it looks like to take those things and give them all to the people that he's serving. Um, in my reading of his life and his work, uh, he was deeply selfless. Um, and I think accompaniment embodies that. And it also brings it into conversation with Gustavo Gutierrez, and their relationship, which is fascinating. And this question of how do the poor and oppressed and marginalized and disenfranchised know that God loves them? And this practice of accompaniment and journeying with people, not just in a time of need, but Farmer says for the long haul, I think is a deep practice of neighbor love as we continue to wrestle with these very same realities in our world today and what it would mean to seek justice and liberation and freedom and goodness in this moment, just as Farmer did in his time. And so I wanted to provide some unique practices, but also have each one resonate and echo with familiar practices that of the church that have been done for centuries and centuries.
Accompaniment also has deep resonances with not only the doctrine of creation, but of providence. In classical Thomistic language, this would be a form of divine concursus or cooperation between divine causality and creaturely causality. And a shout out to Karl Barth because his name for this otherwise Aristotelian notion of concursus is the divine accompanying.
Mm.
So accompaniment also has this divine providential language associated with it, which is quite fascinating. You and I are invested in theology with the church. Theology is an ecclesial science. You and I are also invested in ecclesial practices. And it strikes me that these six practices could be enacted in church settings. I'm also thinking of some of our audience members who might be campus staff workers, where discipleship, evangelism, these type of ministries are foremost. How do you envision these six practices in the life of the church or in the life of ministry?
Yeah, I mean, I talk a bit in the chapter about how the ultimate task of these practices um, is to move from individual moments of compassion to being compassionate people, individual moments of justice to being just people, moments of mercy to being merciful people, graceful people. Uh, in that way, these practices, I think we take up uh, almost as I mean, Paul gives the illustration of training, um, and I think these are muscles that are often difficult to flex, but whether we're functioning in churches or campus ministries or otherwise, I think the task is to find ways to do this such that we begin to form and shape one another into being people uh, who don't even have to consider, should I accompany this person? What would it mean to accompany this person? To someone who naturally acts out of that disposition of you see someone in need, and the immediate response, the reflexive response, is accompaniment, is mercy, is lamentation when tragedy arises. And at first, I think it's a clunky process. Uh, I did a podcast early on here where I had to put into practice lamentation, where it was two podcast hosts, and one of them was talking about a Muslim neighbor of theirs whose child was tragically killed, and they on the call began crying. And in that moment, I was like, all right, this is a practice of lamentation in this moment as we're talking about the book and talking about these practices. And he kept apologizing for crying. And my response, hopefully, I'm not the most pastoral person in the world, but my response was to say, this is the hard work of neighbor love. This is what it looks like to accompany one another, to lament with one another, to resonate in the sense of joining our voice, our instrument, our sound in a with others in a way that creates beautiful noise. Um, and to do that, we have to tune. We have to attune ourselves to one another by listening. And in that moment, there is a time to attune myself so that my tone, my speech, my thought was would resonate with the place that we had found ourselves in. Um, and so I think these for folks wanting to do this work, it requires that deep uh, sense of listening to one another, to not, again, not prescribing, well, I want to practice accompaniment, and so here's how I'm going to do it, and I'm going to go find someone in need, and I'm going to accompany them. Um, but instead saying, build a relationship with someone who might be in need and find what ways accompanying them might look like instead of prescribing, this is what we should do. That's not to ignore strategy. You could think of this that, campus ministers accompany their students in many ways. And for all the complexities of especially undergraduate students, there's a lot of similarities of the crises that they go through, the problems that they have, and it's very good to anticipate those things. And at the same time, I think we always want to be weary of prescribing how we ought to do something, especially how we ought to love our neighbors. And instead, this is why the common good is made local, because we have to do this not in a universal or singular way, but in a deeply contextual way that considers the people around us. And so I hope that these practices provide some encouragement and some framework to then apply to folks' individual context to say, how might I consider this work of translation in my own context, rather than me saying, this is how you should do it.
In chapter 4, you use prophet, priest, king, not only as offices of Christ, but as modes of Christian public action. Can you just explain to our audience how that works? How prophet, priest, and king are indexed to um, certain actions? And then the part two is, how does this relate back to the six practices?
Yeah, definitely. Uh, Prophet, priest, king are the three offices of Christ that John Calvin outlines in his Institutes. I had the joy and terror of rereading the Institutes in 8 weeks in my last quarter of classes, which that's a lot of time with John Calvin, and he's a complicated guy. But it was also a really wonderful deep dive back into his thought and the way that these offices of Christ fit into his broader theological framework. Um, Calvin is, in short, saying that Christ as prophet is the one who not only um, tells what is to come, but proclaims God's will for the world, especially in times where we have gone awry. And the prophet's task is to call people back to God's good vision for the world. Priest, as we're familiar with in the priestly role in our local congregations of pastors and people who literally take on the role of priest, is an act of mediation between God and the world. Uh, Priests, whether they are in the church or whether they are, in the book I cite a handful of musicians and artists, because I think this too is priestly work of mediating the divine realities of God to humanity. And so Christ does that. And then as king is to proclaim that Jesus is Lord over all, that all power on earth and in heaven is contained in Christ. Those practices I see, or those roles I see as prototypes for the way that Christians might engage in the world. Um, we certainly, we talk about folks who have a prophetic voice in this moment or speak prophetically. Um, Often that's a desired position to be seen as prophetic. To those folks, I always say, be careful. The prophets of the Old Testament and modern prophets today often do not want to be prophets. It is tedious and difficult work to do, but I think today we see that in folks who are doing what we often call deconstruction. People who are looking at what has gone awry in the Christian tradition and in sub-traditions of Christianity and say, this is not right, and we need to do something better. And they call up people in positions of power and authority. Um, Priests then are the ones who I think are tasked with going through the rubble of the prophet's work and pulling out the pieces of God's goodness present in that. Priests, again, are endowed, they're the folks who see the world as filled with the glory of God, as Calvin would say, who see the world through a sacramental lens, that see not the sacred in the ordinary, but see the ordinary itself as sacred because God has made it to be. Um, and then kings are folks, certainly I draw a bit from Luke Bretherton, who has a really great book on Christ and the common life. Uh, but they're tasked with this work of forming, norming, and sustaining our common life, often through political office, but also folks who own businesses, who oversee staff, and have means to be philanthropic and start institutions and foundations. These folks are tasked with prioritizing the virtues of Christianity in their work as they do this to benefit the whole. They are the ones who can make policy changes. They are the ones who, through their influence, can advocate for the people who are voiceless or who are rendered voiceless by our society. Um, and so these practices are all these offices can each embody these six practices and many more in the way that they try to live out um, the example that sets, and we might be tempted to divorce them. Calvin's reminder is that Christ is all of them, and we often flow between the three as well. We don't exclusively exist in one category or only function in one category. And so the call ultimately of that chapter is to Christ-likeness. And I think these threefold offices are a way to try and get at that more. But yeah, the call is Christ-likeness, and the practices I hope are guiding principles or guiding paths to do this work well.
You sound kind of reformed.
I say I'm reformed as Schleiermacher will take me. So
Last question, and it's kind of like full circle in the conversation. How, if at all, do Asian American Christians fit into this project of becoming neighbors?
I think Asian Americans have a really unique role in this space because, I mean, as many of your podcasts and articles, and broadly the work that you do and the work that CAAC does, um, elevates this deeply liminal space that Asian Americans inhabit in our society and in the world. Um, Neither here nor there, neither black nor white, uh, always caught in between. Um, many different uh, many different polarities and binaries that never actually account for the fullness of our cultures and societies and neighborhoods. And so, from that space, though, I think Asian Americans in particular, and obviously I'm writing this as an Asian American and positioning my work in that space where I'm like, this isn't a book for this isn't a conservative book, this isn't a progressive book, this isn't a liberal book. This is, as we talked about at the beginning, this book is birthed out of my own lived experience, found in this liminality and trying to find belonging, trying to find my place in propositions of a common good that didn't seem to include me or even have me in mind. And so the challenge, I think, for Asian Americans in becoming neighbors is to say, this is the work of challenging those very binaries, of challenging these universal appeals to the common good that never have an Asian American in mind, and to say, I don't think this is a truly common good or the common good. I think it's a common good for you and your community, for the people who look like you, who share your history or your language, or your assumed set of norms. Um, the task of the table is to challenge those blind spots, to say we all hold pieces of a greater common good that can only be cultivated if we come together. And I think the task for Asian Americans who are often left out of these spaces is to say, no, I belong here. And I have something to say. And I perhaps my family has been here far longer than yours. Perhaps we have something deeply American about us that you will not recognize as American. We have dishes to bring to the potluck that you have not yet tasted, and you don't even know if you enjoy them or not, but you've dismissed them. There is something I find so deeply powerful about bringing Asian Americans in all of their many particularities to the table. And we have our own problems within Asian American as a category, and even within individual countries and neighborhoods, there are Asian Americans who will push back against one another or exclude one another. Um, I think broadly, the experiences and histories that we hold give us a really unique position and voice at the table. And so I think the encouragement is to say, also take your seat, join with everyone else, and speak loudly, and speak authentically and truly from your experience as an Asian American, because it's one that's so often overlooked, even in spaces that we call progressive or inclusive in some form or another. So I think there's a bold place for Asian Americans to exist in this story and in this book, that I hope when Asian Americans pick it up, see that, even if it's not explicit in every page. It's undoubtedly implicit through my entire thinking through the book.
Amar, with the publication of Becoming Neighbors, we have the arrival of an Asian American public theologian. Thank you so much for this podcast. My hope and desire is that your tribe increase.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you making the time and the space to talk about it and share it with the broader community.